Welcome back to another episode of the Urban Guru Podcast, where we feature insights from artists and professionals of color. On today's podcast, we'll interview Milton Davis. Not only is this man a prolific novelist, having published over 20 novels, he's also an editor of several anthologies, an award-winning writer, the owner of his own publishing company, MVMedia, in Atlanta, Georgia, and by day, his mild-mannered alter ego is a chemical engineer. That's right, folks, so stay tuned for an enjoyable chat with Milton Davis of MVMedia. Thank you for agreeing to do this interview with me.
No problem.
And I was looking at your bio and it's like, wow. Avi, come on. Okay, I knew you were a Black speculative fiction writer. And I knew that you owned MV Media, a small publishing company. But all these other things, I knew you did the anthologies, but I did not realize that you were the editor and co-editor of 10 anthologies.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. But see, anthologies are easy. You get a bunch of people to do all the writing, and all you do is put it all together. So they're easy to do.
Okay, Mr. But what about 21 novels? Come on. That's a lot of work. That's a lot of work. So I guess one of my first questions is, it's like, how long have you been a Black speculative writer?
I officially started in 2005. That's when I started writing. Mm-hmm. I started publishing and releasing my books in 2008.
Okay.
So I took those 3 years to sit down and write it should have been my first 3 books, but my first 2 books.
Okay. Yeah.
That third book has never been written, and completely, it's still sitting there waiting to be written. And I promised I was going to finish it either this year or next year. But I spent that time writing books and studying the industry and all that different stuff like that.
Well, let me ask you this. How did you even come to writing? I mean, was it something you always did? Did you write when you were younger? Did you have parents who wrote around you or read to you? What was that?
That was a long evolution. We grew up readers. You're from Columbus. We lived in Cedar Hills. Okay. And we moved there when I was like about 6 years old. And the bookmobile used to stop in front of our house. It stopped on our corner. And me and my sisters would just walk in there, get a bunch of books, walk out. When it came back, we'd take those books like that. So, and plus even before then, I was born in North Carolina, but I don't remember being there. We moved from there when I was like 3 years old. Okay. My first memories were, we used to live in, and you'll know this too, we used to live in Buena Vista Estates. That's where we used to live. And there used to be a convenience store like right down on the bottom of the hill there. They just recently tore that little strip mall down. Mm-hmm. But my mom would give us $1. Mm-hmm. Each one of us $1 every time she got paid. And we would get a comic book, a candy bar, a soda, and a bag of potato chips with $1 and have change.
Wow.
So that's kind of how the reading journey came. The writing was just kind of sporadic. I think the first time I did anything that was when I was in the 5th grade, we had a, what do you call it? I don't want to call it it was for advanced students. We used to go to Carver High School for advanced classes. And I chose, for some odd reason, to this day, I can't really tell you, I guess because I read so much, I chose the English advanced reading. So we would go there, we would read, we would write and stuff like that. Somewhere along the line, I was actually doing art and writing at the time. I decided to write a play, and it was a play about the evils of drug use. And I just wrote it on my own. I gave it to my teacher. She liked it. And next thing you know, they were doing it at the PTA. We had picked people out and all that kind of stuff like that. So that was really my first encounter with writing. But then I didn't do anything else after that. Didn't do any kind of writing after that until I was in college, majoring in chemistry. Anna Holloway, she was my English instructor. And the first time I wrote an essay in her class, she said, I need you to come by my office. And I'm like, okay, what did I do wrong? Like that, And she sat down and said, she said, what's your major? I said, chemistry. She said, you shouldn't be a chemistry major. You should be a writer.
Wow.
And I said, well, that's nice, but writers don't make any money. And I'm living proof of that today. And I said, so
you became a chemist, huh?
Yeah, I'm a chemist. I've been a research chemist forever. But I always said it was her plan to get me in. The way she planned to get me into writing is that she was the person that introduced me into science fiction.
Okay.
Of that point, I never read science fiction. I always just read history stuff and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And she introduced me to Campbell, Asimov, all the classic people and stuff. And I'm reading them. And I'm in college, so this was like assignments to me. I'm reading this stuff and studying it and stuff like that. Then she started talking me into like writing stuff, and she would read it and critique it and stuff like that. So by the time I graduated from Fort Valley, I was like, okay, I'm gonna be a chemist, but I probably could do this writing thing on the side, that kind of thing. And so I played around it. After I graduated from college, got married, I played around with it a little bit, and then I kind of dropped it. I sent some stuff out. Well, I took Writer's Digest class where they hooked you up with a published author, and you did this course with them, and then at the end of it, you submitted to their Writers of the Future contest. I got an honorable mention, and then I took another class at Emory. By that time, I realized I was pretty decent writer. So I started sending stuff out, went from form rejections to actually editors were actually reading my stories and saying, hey, I think this is pretty good, but it's not really for us. And they would suggest other magazines and stuff like that. Then, me and my wife, we started having kids and stuff, and then I just dropped it. And from time to time, I would go back to it, play with it, but it wasn't until I turned 45. And that's when I said, you know what, the one thing that you've always wanted to do and you never really have done is write and publish. And at the time, self-publishing was becoming pretty popular. Basically, the entire street lit industry was basically people self-publishing their own stuff. My wife actually bought me she was at a bookstore, and she said, there was this guy selling this book, and I bought it for you to read it. And I got the book and I started reading. I was like, man, I could write this, I was like, it was a street lit book. I'm like, man, I can do this, so that kind of started me on that path. And that's how it's been ever since, I chose self-publishing because I looked at the industry and I didn't feel like the fact that I wanted to write science fiction and fantasy based on African diaspora culture. I came to the conclusion that the industry as it was then wouldn't be interested in what I was writing. And it was really more important for me to write what I wanted to write and then sell it to people who I felt would be interested in that type of writing in that industry. And I had my own business before, so doing it myself wasn't intimidating to me. I'd had my own business, so I knew the process. I just had to adapt the process to publishing. And so that's why I did it. That's why I started self-publishing, and I've been doing it ever since.
No, that's okay. That's interesting. Kind of curious what kind of business you had, but you don't.
I actually had had a business where we were manufacturing and selling floor care products. That was my expertise at the time. I'm gonna brag a little bit on that. At the time I started that business, I was one of the top floor finish chemists in the country. And I decided that, and I saw in the industry that it was an opportunity for me to build a business that would be beneficial to other Black businesses that were in the industry. Okay. And me having this kind of business would provide them with some of the things that they weren't able to get the way that the business was at that time. And so I did that for about 5 years. But I got to the point where I needed a sizable amount of investment to get to my next level. And what I needed to get, what I needed to give up to get that investment, I didn't feel like it was worth it. So I decided to just shut the business down and go back to work as a chemist. Okay. I always tell people I was one loan away from you guys never knowing who I was.
we're going to get to that, because believe it or not, even though we grew up literally, you throw a stone and hit each other's house, and we have siblings and know each other. The first time I came across you was out of Europe when you did the State of Black Science Fiction and Fantasy at DragonCon. Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's the first time I came across you. But I wanted to go back to, you chose the indie route because you felt that what you wanted to write, it was going to be hard to get it through the traditional gatekeepers, so to speak. Mm-hmm. How did you get focused on writing about ancient Africa? I mean, we both come from the same place. I don't remember growing up hearing too many people talk about. It wasn't until I came up at Howard University of all places, and you walk down the street, and there's this big what not the ark, but the face, the Egyptian face on the front of a bookstore. You know, and you see Malcolm X tapes and stuff like that. It's like, oh, okay. It's like, oh, this stuff existed. Now I understand what some of the people were saying a long time ago.
Yeah.
And then working with Haile Garima, he's a really conscious type person. So it's like, how did you, coming out of Columbus, Georgia, how did you get focused in on ancient Africa?
My introduction to African history was actually at Fort Valley.
Okay.
I had a instructor named Dr. Grant, who oddly enough was a white instructor, and he taught African history. And that's when I first heard about the Cushites and all this stuff. Egypt was always around, but it was never presented as being a Black African culture. And but when I had Dr. Grant, that's when I got introduced to all that. And it was fascinating to me because I'm a big history buff anyway. And that's where I was first introduced to it. As far as how I got into it from a writing standpoint in the 90s, I just had this decision. I said, I know so much about European history and American history, but I don't know anything about African history. So I just set out to just educate myself on that. I started, searching for books, going to the libraries, reading them and stuff like that, just everywhere I went. I tell people I went through my African Renaissance. I was wearing like kente ties and had my kufi, and I was like into it 1,000% and stuff.
Wow.
And I, at first I thought I wasn't going to be able to find a lot of information because I had never been exposed to it in the past. But every time I started digging, I started finding more and more information. And it was a thing about, at first I was trying to say, well, am I going to have enough information to start? But then I got to a point saying, man, where do I start? I got so much information, where do I start first and stuff, and that just that really started me into doing that. And by the time I decided to start writing on a regular basis, I had already determined that this is the direction that I wanted to write from, because this was basically a part of my history that went beyond, the Middle Passage. And I felt like it was something that was important for people to know. And I felt one of the best vehicles to educate people on that history was through fiction, and science fiction and fantasy was just something that I liked. So I said I would just incorporate that history into those genres and stuff.
And you kind of reminded me, I think for me, it was college, and again, what you were saying, even getting into, first of all, the traditional, science fiction and fantasy big authors like Asimov and stuff. I didn't find out about that. And then Herbert with Dune and stuff till I was in college. I was introduced to them at the same time. But I remember when I came up to Howard, I had a professor who spoke like 7 different languages. He could speak the clicking tongue of South the band.
Oh yeah,
He was like fantastic because he grew up there, Professor Ford, and so like he said, when he was growing up, he had to speak Spanish and Italian and all this stuff because you're playing soccer here. And but he went up to the board and he talked about history, and he drew a circle and he says, "Okay, this represents Western European history." When they were going through their 1,000 years of the Dark Ages and stuff like that, you still had Far East and you still had Africa, and they were fine and they were doing their stuff. And when he put that up there, it blew my mind, because I always loved history too. I would read encyclopedias, I would look up stuff from foreign, I wanted to go to all these different places, and I liked history. And when he threw that up there, it just never dawned on me that I was siloed into a Western history perspective on everything.
Yeah.
And when he did that, it just blew it so open. And then I just, like I said, I'm here in DC, and that's when I went on my knowledge journey and stuff like that. And you started learning about these things. It's like, where was all this information before? Where was all
this? I tell people it was hidden in plain sight.
Yeah.
It was there, but nobody was taking you to it, and nobody was sharing it with you. And
yes. And you also discovered just some of the things that you actually like in science fiction and fantasy or in comic books. You find that it had an African source.
Yep.
And the people who are using it know that. Which is why it's kind of funny now when people talk about race swapping and bending. It's like, yeah, that kind of sort of happened when they took those original African tales and, washed them, so to speak.
Yeah, I'll tell people, I said the history of ancient Egypt is probably the biggest example of whitewashing ever, because, we're talking about indigenous African cultures that developed this civilization, and you don't really see an introduction of anything outside of that until you get to the Ptolemies from Greece, and people argue about it, but, the facts are there, and so it's always been situations, even when you see, when I was doing research on the Moors and Moorish Spain, you still had people up to a certain point who were debating whether or not the Moors were actually black-skinned Africans. Yeah. And I'm like, okay, how can you argue this? Every painting and image you have from that time period depicts Moors like that. These people could see, they knew what they were drawing. I mean, Shakespeare's Othello, so how can you argue that point when it's obviously there? But that just kind of shows you the effort to tone down that narrative. And just on this, I'll stop in a minute. When I was doing some research on for one of my books, I wanted to have a character this was a steampunk novel, and it was an alternate history situation in the 1870s. And I wanted to have one of my characters be originally from Cuba. And I wanted her to be part of this revolution. And I was calling myself basing this on the Cuban Revolution in the 50s and the 60s. But when I started doing the research, I found out that during the 19th century, there was actually a revolution going on in Cuba for freedom that lasted almost 30 years. And the biggest hero of that revolution was a black man by the name Antonio Maceo. He was the well-known general, fought the Spanish, and see, when we learned about Cuba, we learned that the USS Maine was blown up in Havana Harbor, and then we ended the war. But in reality, the Cubans had been in revolt for all those years, and they were just about to win that revolution when America stepped in. And so it was a 30-year history leading up to that. And I didn't know any of this stuff. And I started learning about all this history and stuff like that. And, and it was like, man, but after the Americans moved in and they had all these paintings and pictures of Antonio Maceo because he got killed in battle, the Americans started saying, well, why don't you start lightening up his skin a little bit in these paintings and stuff, And so when you see some of the later paintings of Antonio Maceo, he looks like he's white, So it's just, these are the things that you find out when you start really, and all you have to do is go to the original sources. You don't have to, because one of the biggest problems that they had in Spain was that the Spanish planters were trying to say, well, because Antonio Maceo is black, if the revolutionaries win the war, they're going to turn Cuba into another Haiti. And that was an argument to keep people from supporting Antonio Maceo. But anyway, I can go on forever. Don't get me started on history.
But it is fascinating because I was able to hear you on a panel recently, and you and Beverly, I forget her last name, but y'all talking about the history.
Beverly Jenkins, yeah,
in the different history and stuff. And I was listening to one guy who was talking about original sources, and it used to be that way back in the day, you'd have to fly here and here and go to where they were kept to get them. But then nowadays, for whatever reason, so many universities and museums and stuff like that, they're going back and they're putting these original sources, they're scanning them.
Yeah.
And there's much more access to original sources from the 1500s to 1600s, where a lot of times they will tell you exactly what these people look like.
Yeah, and you don't have to sit there and listen to this history that's coming from this person, that's coming from this person, that's coming from this person that has an agenda. I just bought a book about medieval Iberia, which is basically Moorish Spain, Al-Andalus, whatever you want to call it. And it's a collection of papers that were written during that time period, from the beginning of when the Muslims first took over to the end. And there are papers that were written by Christians, Jewish people, Muslim people, and these are papers that were written during that time.
Yeah.
So there's no reason for me to listen to people debate about the source, debate about what was happening there, when I can actually go to the source and read what they were writing about.
Yeah, and it's always funny when people do these alternative histories. It's always one group of Europeans winning over the other ones. And it's like, but the real history is far more fantastic than even we sometimes, which kind of goes into what you're saying. You're doing aspirational stories, inspirational stories, all the books that you publish through your company. How important is that for you, that your books come across that way?
Well, I read for escape. I write the kind of books I like to read. I don't want to go through what I have to go through every day as a person and as a Black person, and then come and read fiction where the characters are going through the same thing that I'm going through every day. there's nothing.
Oh yeah.
There's nothing uplifting to me about that. So when I read and when I write, I want to write stories that, you want your characters to have struggles and go through things, but eventually I want my characters to be able to work things out. I want things to end well for them. And because to me, that's why I read. I read for escape. I read to see that happy ending. I read to see that struggle and that triumph. And I think for Black people, I think it's especially important. We need to tell the stories about our struggles. People need to see those stories. Because of the fact that people have been trying to hide them, that we don't get the real impact of what we went through as a people. But at the same time, we need to have stories that balance that, because we grew up in the South. We grew up in the Jim Crow South. We know what our parents and our grandparents went through. But at the same time, we know that they had good times and they celebrated, and a lot of them accomplished what they wanted to accomplish within these restrictions and stuff. And I think we need to balance, and our stories need to be balanced by those stories. And so that's why I said there's plenty of people that can give you this other side of it, but this is the side I'm going to concentrate on, because these are the stories that I want to tell.
Yeah, and I remember having that conversation when I was still working for the school system up there with one of the English teachers, and we were talking about, they always pick out the Black novel, always around February, that the class is going to read and stuff like that. And I was having a conversation. It's like, and she said it herself. It was a Black English teacher. And she said, so many times they give the award to people, and what these students are reading is, like you just said, it's the rough stuff that they might be experiencing in life. Now they're going to come and read a novel about a character who's on the streets. Yeah. And so I really like your push for aspirational African content. Plus, you're giving people a little history lesson. You're giving them content. I mean, when I'm reading your books or listening to the audio book, it's like some of the details that you have in there. Like for the one that with the father and the daughter playing that game, and the detail in there and stuff. It's like, wow. Wow.
The long walk was a fun story, and it was actually inspired by a friend of mine who's from Trinidad. And he sent me this video one day. He said, "Hey Milton," because he knows I used to be in the martial arts and stuff. He said, "Hey Milton, check this out." And it was a video about the stick fighting style in Trinidad using the bois. And I had never heard of that before. And I was like, oh man. So I just started watching all these videos about this bois stick fighting and stuff, And from that video, I started to piece together the story. I knew I wanted that to be part of the story. And I knew about, when you have different African cultures, you have talismans, and that talismans can be possessed by, contain the spirit of people and different things like that. So that whole story started to come together based on that one thing. And the rhythms and the chants that I got from the story was basically just talking to the same guy about some of the things that he experienced growing up in Trinidad. And I tried to incorporate them as much as I could. I deliberately did not, have the story take place on Trinidad, because I don't know enough about Trinidadian culture to be able to tell a story in that world. But I felt like I had enough information to where I could take somebody from that background and bring them into America, particularly the American South during that time, which I do know, and then tell the story in that context, So.
Yeah, but it's a different take, because that father is coming from a different place. There's an inherent strength in him, but there's also that protectiveness as he's teaching his daughter how to deal with these American bigots.
Yeah, because it's a different culture. You have to, because something, I'm a Pan-Africanist. I believe in Pan-Africanism, But I also acknowledge the fact that, throughout the diaspora and throughout the continent, we have a bunch of different cultures, and all those cultures bring different experiences. And I remember a conversation I was having a few years ago. Actually, it was a brother from England who called me and wanted to do an interview. And it was me, him, and a brother from Nigeria. And we were talking and we were discussing and we were talking about these cultural differences and stuff, about how, I had an example of a brother that I knew, that I worked with, that was from Cote d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast. And he was taking this class and he came to me one day, he was like looking kind of distraught. I said, "What's going on?" He said, "Man, we read this poem in my class written by Maya Angelou, and I've got to write a report on this poem. And I don't know what to write about it." And I read the poem, and it was a poem that was written around the civil rights movement. And there was a lot of symbolism in the story that if you were an African-American and you would experience the civil rights movement, you knew what she was saying. But he was from Ivory Coast. And this wasn't in his personal experience. So he's looking at like, what is this stuff? So, I basically did the essay for him. He got an A on it. I sat down and wrote the essay for him because I knew exactly what she was talking about, and it's those things that, that are different about our cultures in these different parts of the world. And I think that it's the challenges as an author is, trying to bring those things out and make connections from them, especially if it's not your particular culture, Yeah. And the thing about with them, when we were talking about, was that the brother from Nigeria was talking about reading Meji, and he was saying he was talking to his mom and he was asking her questions. And I was kind of stumped. I was like, well, this is, you live in this culture. He said, yeah. But we're taught British history. We're not taught our own history. So he said at some point, African Americans probably knew more about African history than Africans did because of the way that we were being educated, And so it's interesting about how that whole process is and stuff. Yeah.
Cool, interesting. So as I mentioned, I first met you as the author when you were doing the State of Black Sci-Fi, and I think you and the other group of authors were doing it at Emory University. I think you're doing like we did. That was actually our first State of Black Science Fiction presentation was at Emory. Okay. That was the first time we did it. Yeah. That was 2012. And then you came over when I saw you did it at Dragon Con. Yeah. And you did it 2 years in a row. And that was the best thing because for me, it really felt like we had a space in Dragon Con. Yeah. Because you slowly started seeing us cosplaying, being in the masquerade, and then all of you came in there. Now you're these authors, but then eventually y'all got, spread to the four winds. But there was a quote that you said at one of your things, which I think is really relevant today when we talk, when we're going through this change culturally, and you're starting to see more representation. And I know you and Minister Faust talked about having stuff that's not only about us, but stuff that's done by us, and it's also aspirational. But again, it's not that downtrodden, we're going to retell the same story. But one of the things that you said, and I remember it, and I quote it all the time, and I give you credit for it, it's not me. You said, like going back to those original sci-fi masters that you read and stuff, for us to really enjoy comic books and sci-fi and stuff like that, we kind of had to get over not seeing ourselves as the main character. Yeah. Initially, Yeah. And that's where we come in now. We're trying to fill that gap. But I really think that's that really resonates with me because I see so many people now that want to say, well, you don't need to see yourself represented to enjoy a story. And it's like, yeah, but we know that.
I mean, when growing up in Columbus, there were certain things I just accepted. I accepted that when I read these type of stories, I wasn't going to see a Black main character. And because, I'm growing up, that's just how I was. Just like when I grew up in the South, I accepted the fact that our state flag had a Confederate symbol on it because we was in the South, and that's what people do in the South. We just kind of grew up in that. Our parents were dealing with it and accepting it, so we just kind of accepted the same thing. But nothing brings the story home more than to know that, to see that main character that looks like you and probably coming from the same experiences as you. Because I remember when I first saw Octavia Butler's book. Man, I always forget the name of that book
Fledgling Parable of the.
It was the one where the woman could change into different shapes and stuff like that. Ooh. And then she was having an encounter with the guy his name was Doro, who would like consume people's souls and take over them. It wasn't Kindred. It was I always forget the name of that book, but it was actually the first Black science fiction book that I read, and I grabbed it because it was on the shelf in Walden Books, and it was a Black woman on the front. I was like, I don't even care what this book is about. I'm getting this book. I'm going to read it, and I enjoyed it, and I read the whole series and stuff, and I had that deeper connection to it than I had with any other science fiction book I ever read because these characters were Black.
Yeah,
and it was partially based in African history, so I connected with that because at the time that's what I was reading, and I think I really, kids that are growing up now, they don't have to dig as much for it as we had to. It's there now. I mean, it's out there. You got N.K. Jemisin's won 3 Hugo Awards in a row. You got Nnedi Okorafor out there. You got more all these different authors out there now, and it's right there, and it's in the mainstream. They don't have to dig and find it and stuff. Mm-hmm. I think about people who probably read my books when I first released them. If you were 10 years old and you read one of my books in 2008, you're 18 years old now. You're like in your 20s now and stuff like that. So you have virtually grown up with Black science fiction and fantasy in front of you. So it's not like you've grown up and you haven't felt deprived by it because it's always been around. So it's really exciting.
Yeah. A couple more questions. Afrofuturism. I know it wasn't coined, but which I was surprised. I did not know it wasn't coined by us.
No, it wasn't.
And when I found that out, and I know that on the continent of Africa, they have African futurism as opposed to Afrofuturism, which is more considered African American. But what does Afrofuturism mean for you, and how does that play into what you do with your company?
Well, for me, I have a very narrow definition of what Afrofuturism means, because to me, futurism is related to the future. So when I think about Afrofuturism, I'm always thinking about science fiction. I'm thinking about looking into the future and looking at it from an African, Afrocentric perspective. Now it's been adopted by the mainstream to be a blanket term for all fantastic fiction that's being created by Black authors. And I read a ton of essays by different people explaining how that's possible and how it should work. Like even if it's stuff that's written in the past or about the past, it still has a futuristic connotation. And I think it depends on the person, because when I first heard the term, it was basically used in relation with music and art. There really wasn't any prose that anybody was writing that was considered Afrofuturism. It was basically Sun Ra and Parliament Funkadelic, Earth, Wind and Fire. Basically, and the funny thing is, like everything else, these people doing what they were doing at the time would not have called it Afrofuturism. For them, they were doing science fiction. They were just doing science fiction from a Black perspective. And in an African perspective, especially with Earth, Wind and Fire, you look at some of the visuals on their albums and stuff. They were really, they were taking that Egyptian foundation, and because there's one album that they have that actually is a double album cover, and it's basically got the pyramids looking like modern buildings and spaceships taking off and stuff like that. So they were like taking that past and future and using that past foundation and projecting it into the future. Now, to me, that is Afrofuturism. I don't necessarily consider Sword and Soul that I write to be Afrofuturism. Okay. But in taking the words from one of my author friends, I don't care what you call it as long as you buy it. That's what he says all the time. But I think it's an interesting concept. I think it's the term that people are using now. There are some African authors who also consider their work Afrofuturism. There are some that don't. Nnedi was the person who basically coined the term African futurism because she felt like, what she was doing was rooted in African culture, specifically in Igbo culture, where she is from. as opposed to Afrofuturism, which is more associated with African American culture. Mm-hmm. And I'm all about us creating our own terms to describe what we do.
I was going to ask you if you had come up with one. And the only reason I did that, do you know who Dr. Carr is? I don't know if he's at Howard. He's up, I think it's Greg Carr. Have you ever heard of him before?
No, I'm not familiar with him.
He's a really good historian. He talks about African history and stuff like that. But he taught a class, and I had a friend who was taking it, and they had to write an essay or a journal or something that embodied Afrofuturism. You had to take us where we are now and then project it into the future. Mm-hmm. And my friend wrote a story, which was, and I was looking at it and helping her with it, but she gave me his rundown on how you break down culture, governance, ways of knowing. It's just all of these things that you can use to break it down. And so I did that for my current novel, which I think is Afrofuturism because it's kind of set in the future and it's projecting us. My current books, they're fantasy. They're not Afrofuturism.
Yeah.
But when I was doing it, I came up to that term Afrofuturism. And it's like, I was saying then, I wish I had a different word, a different term for it. And that's why when you said that, it kind of got me excited because I'm just wondering, have you come up with another term to use yet?
Well, Sword and Soul was basically created by Charles Saunders when he was asked, because he was the first person to write African-based sword and sorcery. Mm-hmm. And when he was being interviewed, somebody asked him, well, what would you call it? He said Sword and Soul. And, Charles was like, he was growing up during the 60s and stuff. So he was really in tune to that concept. Mm-hmm. Steampunk is the same way. To me, the part of the reason of defining it is because in so many instances, things that we do as a people have been defined by other people, and comes with their definitions and their restrictions as well. For me, it was really important to try to give whatever I was writing different names because I wanted people to know exactly what they were getting when they picked my books up.
Yeah.
When you buy Sword and Soul, you're getting African-based sword and sorcery. Mm-hmm. When you buy Steampunk, you're getting African-based steampunk. Mm-hmm. You don't have to sift through anything to try to figure out what it is. It's the name itself is telling you what you're getting. Okay. And I think for us as a people, it's important that we define ourselves. What we do, and give it. And so with me, it's like, I don't do it with everything that I do, but sometimes I'll look at something that I'm writing and I'll say, this is a little different. So I don't want to call it this. I want to call it something else. And part of it's marketing too. I want to give it something that will define it to the people who are looking for it, who are reading it. And so they'll be very clear on what they're getting when they buy that particular book or read or listen to that particular audiobook.
And I can say this, looking at your list of works, and every time you come out, because I follow you, because you're my example of how to take care of marketing and pushing your stuff out. But it's like, man, what is he doing now? Okay, this is different from this. It's like, and I'm looking at it's like, man, you have, I agree with Minister Faust. It's like, you got a ton load of stuff here. It's like, wow. I mean, I would ask you, how do you manage to, you have a job, you have a family, day job, or you had a day job, I don't know if you still have it. You have a business, 2 businesses that you mentioned, but yet you put out all of this content and you're winning awards and stuff. So you actually have time to submit it and deal with that. And you're going to conventions. It's like,
well, I read before I got into writing, I was reading this article about this guy who writes screenplays. Mm-hmm. He was actually a instructor in college, and he wrote the screenplay for Ghost. Okay. And he had originally written this screenplay for another movie that I can't remember. The movie didn't do that well, but he won an Oscar for best screenplay, and that gave him the opportunity to write the screenplay for Ghost. Mm-hmm. And he said that he would write 1 page of script every day. And the average length of a script is 90 pages. So every 3 months he had a completed script. Mm-hmm. And then he would put that in the mail, send it out, and the next day he started writing his next script. And he said that's how he basically did it. And so my thing was, okay, Milt, when you start doing this, you're going to write a page a day. That's going to be your thing, a page a day. And that's how I started. Every morning I get up earlier than I normally would, and I sit there and I would write, and then at the end of the day, when I got home, I would finish that page. So I write a page a day. So,
and even if you had to break it up in the chunks, maybe start at the beginning of the day and then maybe finish it at the end of the day, you made sure that you did a page a day.
Exactly. I blocked out that time. And see, that's one thing I tell a lot of people. I say, you don't really realize how much free time you actually have. I said, look at your day and look at how you spend your day. And I bet you'll find at least 2 or 3 hours where you actually not doing nothing. You may be sitting in front of a television or something like that. And some people need that as relaxed time. So I'm like, instead of me doing this, let me take that hour. Mm-hmm. And instead of like maybe watching TV or flipping through the newspaper, I'm going to take that 1 hour and I'm just going to sit there and write that entire hour, And
so that was my pieces of advice for people. Right. Be consistent, write every day, and pick a time. And I'm assuming you're saying be consistent with the time you pick also.
Yeah, because I found out my best time of the day was in the morning. Mm-hmm. When I came home in the afternoons after I got settled, I just didn't have the focus to sit down and create. So I use my evenings to revise and edit and stuff. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But in the morning, that was creation time because my mind was fresh. I wasn't thinking about anything else. So I could sit down and pick up where I left off. And on the weekends, I wrote more because it was Saturday or Sunday. I had more time. But during the week, it was at least an hour a day. Mm-hmm. And I tried my best to at least write that page a day,
And so that's your secret to producing so many diverse, cohesive.
and I don't write long books either. I mean, I don't write 100,000 word books. That's not in me. I don't write epics and.
Well, that's interesting. What would you say is? Do you know what the average length of your novels are?
I set a goal for my books to be at least 50,000 words. Oh, yes, wow. My book's going to be at least 50,000 words. Whether or not it goes beyond that depends on the story. I think the most I've ever written has probably was Meji, really my first book. Mm-hmm. Now, Meji has a ton of, Meji is like the longest book I ever wrote. Mm-hmm. I think Meji has Meji probably comes close to about 100,000. But I had 3 years to write it.
So if you were to do something like that again, you probably do a part 1 and part 2.
Yeah, actually, and Meji was part 1 and part 2 because when I first wrote it, the first advice I got as a self-publisher was that somebody read the manuscript, said it's a great story, but split it into 2 books because nobody wants to read a 500-page book by a brand new author. No. That was the advice they gave me there. And so I split the book up into 2 books.
And it sounds like you found your, I don't want to say natural rhythm because you have your rhythm when you write, but you found your natural length, if that's a good word for it.
Yeah, that's a comfortable length for me. I'm not a very verbose writer. Yeah. I try for precision. I was really inspired by James Baldwin. Mm-hmm. The first time I read one of his books, I was just blown away. I was like, how do you say so much in so few words? Yeah. Because I was coming from being damaged in school by reading James Fenimore Cooper, who would spend like two pages describing a tree. So when I read James Baldwin, it was like culture shock. I was like, man, this guy's like telling out and describing. And so I kind of modeled my writing around his writing and how, trying to emulate that same style. So, and to me, to do that, you have to really try to take time to find the right words. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Find those right words that are gonna say what you need them to say. So it's tough for me to get to 50,000. It's tough for me to get that long. But I do have some books that are 60,000, and I think I have maybe one that goes at about 70,000. But it's hard for me to do that. And usually the ones that are like 70,000, 60,000 are really not novels. They're like a collection of short stories about the same character. Yeah. And because like Etta Blessed, it's basically like a bunch of different stories about that one character. And so because you put all those stories together, you're getting something that's like 70,000 words and stuff.
Yeah. You found your natural length, what feels right for you. Because even as a writer, even when I'm writing scenes, I know when a scene is going too long because I found that I have a number of words that are really good seeing that I know I got everything in there and it's moving. If I'm going beyond that, in the back of my mind, it's like, yeah, you need to go check that because you know.
And that's the good thing about being an indie writer, because, you know, a lot of mainstream publishers, they have certain numbers, like somebody's like, well, you know, the average novel has to be 100,000 words. I said, well, they want to push for 100,000 words because of their economies. They get certain discounts and stuff when they have so many pages and stuff. So a lot of it doesn't really have anything to do with you need those many words to tell a story. It's just that you need those many words for me to get to a certain length. When I make your book, the discounts kick in. So there's a lot of other things that are influencing the type of book you write and how long you write it that has nothing to do with you telling the story.
Yeah.
And those are some of the things that I discovered when I was researching the industry. And I'm like, I don't want all this stuff on me. I don't want all these, me having to try to meet certain links because it's going to affect that and all that kind of stuff.
Cool. Well, thank you for the interview. And so what should people be looking for next from Milton Davis or from your company, MVMedia?
Well, in June, I'm going to do something I've never done before. I'm going to be releasing 3 books in June. One of them is a novel called Black Rose, which is my first historical fiction novel. And 2 of them are going to be anthologies. One is going to be the Terminus 2 anthology, which is a follow-up to our Terminus anthology from the Atlanta Futurism Group in Atlanta. And the other one is going to be the long-awaited Spy Funk anthology. We started in 2017 and we're finally getting it out this year and stuff. So that's probably the biggest thing that we've got going on right now.
All right. Well, thank you, Milton Davis, for taking your time to drop all this knowledge on us. And I really appreciate it, man.
Hey, thanks, man. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to another edition of the Urban Guru podcast. And of course, you can always find us on iTunes. Just search for Urban Guru and you'll find our podcast listed. You can also listen to this podcast on SoundCloud. Just search for Urban Guru Podcast and you'll be able to find it there too. Thank you again for listening. And remember, no matter whatever your creative endeavor is, always push forward, because every step that you take along that path will lead you to your ultimate destination. So I'll see you next time.